Anatta, why you don't really exist. The essence of the Buddha's teachings is liberation from dukkha, a Pali term we often simply translate as suffering. However, the truth is that it encompasses much more, referring to a range of experiences from dissatisfaction, disappointment to unfulfilled dreams and every feeling of unhappiness in life. According to the Buddha, human suffering originates from ignorance, stemming from a discrepancy between the way we perceive reality and its true nature. Avidya is considered the greatest cause of suffering for sentient beings. One of the most serious and harmful misunderstandings we have about reality is the mistaken notion of self. If you ask someone what the ego is, they might say, "It is all my senses, my emotions, all my imaginations, my romantic love demands, every sentiment of mine, husband, wife, my entire being, every struggle of mine, every achievement of mine, every ambition of mine, every desire of mine, every suffering of mine, and every joy of mine." All of that would be considered the ego. You could add a few more words, but essentially it remains the center, the I, every impulse of the I, and so on and so forth. From this center, all activities occur, all our desires, our ambitions, our arguments, our disagreements, our concepts, our prejudices, and all our experiences are the center of this phenomenon. What is the source of all troubles? The I is an element that is actively working at all times. It remains the same I under various names, with different skin colors, in different professions, and with different statuses within the social hierarchy. You are a lord and so on, while someone else may be a servant. It is also the I that divides itself in all aspects, social, economic, and religious. Where there is this division, there is certainly conflict. Hindu followers oppose Muslim followers, Judaism, Arabs, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. This is evident in the material aspect and has led to horrific battles, immense suffering, violence, and cruelty. The ego identifies with ideals, either noble or ignoble, and it fights for those ideals. But still, it remains the journey of the ego. People come to India in an effort to explore spirituality. They don themselves in splendid attire, but they only change their clothing. Fundamentally, they are still the same I in operation, continuously struggling, attempting to grasp, reject, deeply entangled with all their experiences, concepts, ideas, and desires. And as we live, we observe that this center, this I, is the essence of numerous troubles. The Buddha asserted that only by abandoning misconceptions about the self and deeply understanding our true nature can we reduce suffering, dukkha, and move towards a more peaceful, harmonious life. Chapter 1. What is the doctrine of Anatta? Anatta is a crucial term in Buddhist teachings. Impermanence, anicca, and non-self, anatta, are two characteristics, two intrinsic natures of all phenomena referred to as dhammas, dharmas. Impermanence was discussed even before the birth of the Buddha, but the perspective was that some things are eternal and some are impermanent, not that all dharmas are impermanent as realized and proclaimed by the Buddha. Regarding non-self, only the Buddha, uniquely throughout history, realized and taught this concept. Non-self is one of the most challenging concepts to grasp. The Buddha did not advocate or engage in metaphysical debates, yet, right after his first sermon, which laid the foundation for the entire Dhamma, the Four Noble Truths, he did not hesitate to introduce the concept of anatta. At that time, Besides the first 5 disciples who had just heard the teaching on the 4 Noble Truths, no one knew what the Buddha's Dhamma was. In the context of the prevailing beliefs of that era, most people believed in a permanent, unchanging soul, jiva, atman, existing within each individual, and a supreme soul or supreme self, paramatman, Brahman, beyond human comprehension and somewhere in the universe. For the Buddha, all phenomena are continuously forming, without any exception. Thus, they do not contain any fixed or unchanging entity. The Buddha only acknowledges a self as an illusion created by the mind, a self that only has value in conventional terms. The grasping of a self or ego is merely our way of assimilating the temporary aggregates, skandhas, that form an individual as a permanent self to cling to. It is this clinging, upadana, that is the cause of suffering and binds us to the cycle of rebirths. The Buddha taught about non-self in many different scriptures. However, essentially, there are 2 main approaches. The first approach is to demolish the erroneous thoughts that this is mine, I am this is myself. The second approach is to refute the notion that an aggregate or a combination of aggregates is the self. In the first approach, the Buddha connects non-self with the concept of the 5 aggregates, skandhas, that constitute the human individual. In the second approach, the Buddha links non-self to the principle of dependent origination, concerning the 12-link chain known as the 12 nidanas. Generally, when seeking to understand a concept, it should be placed within the context of the entire Dhamma. This method helps us see more accurately the position and role of that concept in relation to other concepts in the teachings. Furthermore, a comprehensive view enables us to perceive the entirety of the concepts in the Dhamma more coherently, and as we become accustomed to this perception, understanding becomes more direct without the need for reasoning and analysis every time. Indeed, a fragmented understanding can lead to confusion, superficiality, or forced interpretations. Below are 2 short scriptures that record the Buddha's sermons representative of the 2 preaching methods mentioned above. Chapter 2. The Anattalakkhaṇa Sutta. Discourse on the not-self characteristic. Before we delve into this significant discourse, it's important to understand that in Buddhism, all dharmas, phenomena, are divided into 2 groups. Rupa, material phenomena, which include physical and physiological aspects, and nama, mental phenomena. These dharmas can also be categorized into 5 groups, known as the 5 aggregates, skandhas, which include rupa, material form. This is the physical element that includes physical and physiological aspects such as the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and the objects of the senses, like form, sound, smell, taste, and tactile objects. Vedana, feelings or sensations. Vedana refers to the sensations or feelings that arise from the contact between the sense organs and their objects, such as the feeling of seeing an image or hearing a sound. Sankhara, perceptions. This aggregate encompasses cognition, or the direct awareness by the mind of the senses. Sankhara, mental formations. Sankhara means volitions, desires, daily habits, thought habits, and reactive patterns, for example, comparison, discrimination, craving, aversion, delusion, etc. Vijnana, consciousness. This is consciousness or the ability to know, also referred to as the knowing mind. The Anattalakkhaṇa Sutta is considered the second discourse after the setting forth of the 4 Noble Truths, delivered by the Buddha to his first disciples, the 5 ascetics of the Khandana family. This sutta fundamentally addresses the non-self nature of the five aggregates, illustrating that none of these aggregates can be truly considered as self because they are impermanent and subject to change. This teaching is a cornerstone of Buddhist philosophy, emphasizing the understanding of non-self as essential for the realization of enlightenment and liberation from suffering. I have heard it this way. Once, the Blessed One was dwelling in the deer park at Isipatana near Benares. The Blessed One addressed the five monks. Monks, form, body, is not self. If form were self, then form would not lead to suffering, and one could say of form, "Let my form be thus, let my form not be thus." But because form is not self, it leads to suffering, and none can say of form, "Let my form be thus, let my form not be thus." Monks, feeling is not self. If feeling were self, then feeling would not lead to suffering, and one could say of feeling, "Let my feeling be thus, let my feeling not be thus." But because feeling is not self, it leads to suffering, and none can say of feeling, "Let my feeling be thus, let my feeling not be thus." This passage highlights the Buddha's teaching on the non-self nature of physical form and feelings. The inability to control form and feeling to avoid suffering underscores the truth of anatta, demonstrating that these aggregates do not constitute an inherent self. This teaching is a fundamental aspect of understanding the nature of existence in Buddhism, leading to the realization that clinging to the aggregates as if they were self is a source of suffering. Monks, perception is not self. If perception were self, then perception would not lead to suffering, and one could say of perception, "Let my perception be thus, let my perception not be thus." But because perception is not self, it leads to suffering, and none can say of perception, "Let my perception be thus, let my perception not be thus." Monks, mental formations are not self. If mental formations were self, then mental formations would not lead to suffering, and one could say of mental formations, "Let my mental formations be thus, let my mental formations not be thus." But because mental formations are not self, they lead to suffering, and none can say of mental formations, "Let my mental formations be thus, let my mental formations not be thus." Monks, consciousness is not self. If consciousness were self, then consciousness would not lead to suffering, and one could say of consciousness, "Let my consciousness be thus, let my consciousness not be thus." But because consciousness is not self, it leads to suffering, and none can say of consciousness, "Let my consciousness be thus, let my consciousness not be thus." This passage further elaborates on the Buddha's discourse on the non-self, anatta, nature of the remaining aggregates, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. By explaining that these components of existence are beyond control and inherently lead to suffering when clung to as self, the Buddha underscores the fundamental principle that identifying with any aspect of the five aggregates as I or mine is a misunderstanding that binds beings to the cycle of suffering and rebirth. Recognizing this non-self nature is key to liberation. So monks, what do you think? Is form permanent or impermanent? Venerable. Sir, form is impermanent. If something is impermanent, is it suffering or happiness? Venerable. Sir, it is suffering. Therefore, if something is impermanent and leads to suffering, subject to change, can it be said of it, "This is mine, this is me, this is myself"? Venerable sir, certainly not. So monks, what do you think? Are feelings permanent or impermanent? Venerable sir, feelings are impermanent. If something is impermanent, is it suffering or happiness? Venerable sir, it is suffering. Therefore, if something is impermanent and leads to suffering, subject to change, can it be said of it, "This is mine, this is me, this is myself"? Venerable Sir, certainly not. So monks, what do you think? Is perception permanent or impermanent? Venerable Sir, perception is impermanent. If something is impermanent, is it suffering or happiness? Venerable Sir, it is suffering. Therefore, if something is impermanent and leads to suffering, subject to change, can it be said of it, "This is mine, this is me, this is myself"? Venerable Sir, certainly not. So monks, what do you think? Are mental formations permanent or impermanent? Venerable Sir, mental formations are impermanent. If something is impermanent, is it suffering or happiness? Venerable Sir, it is suffering. Therefore, if something is impermanent and leads to suffering, subject to change, can it be said of it, "This is mine, this is me, this is myself"? Venerable Sir, certainly not. So, monks, what do you think? Is consciousness permanent or impermanent? Venerable Sir, consciousness is impermanent. If something is impermanent, is it suffering or happiness? Venerable Sir, it is suffering. Therefore, if something is impermanent and leads to suffering subject to change, can it be said of it, "This is mine, this is me, this is myself"? Venerable Sir, certainly not. In summary, monks, regarding whatever is the body, whether in the past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, mundane or sublime, far or near, one must view them all with correct wisdom as it really is, saying, "This is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself." Similarly, monks, regarding whatever is feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, whether in the past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, mundane or sublime, far or near, one must view them all with correct wisdom as it really is, saying, "This is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself." Monks, if one views all phenomena in this way, then a disciple with understanding will no longer cling to the body, will no longer cling to feelings, will no longer cling to perceptions, will no longer cling to mental formations, will no longer cling to consciousness. By relinquishing them, one will no longer crave. When there is no more clinging, such a disciple will liberate oneself from all desires. Having liberated oneself from all desires, such a disciple will realize liberation is thus, and they will understand that all rebirths have been eradicated. Only the pure path of virtue exists. What needed to be ended has ended. There is nothing left to await further action, nothing more to be formed. The Blessed One preached thus. The 5 monks were satisfied and joyfully accepted his teachings. Furthermore, as they were still listening to the sermon, all defilements in their consciousness were successively purified. At that moment, 6 arahants appeared in this world. Chapter 3. Non-Self and the Theory of Dependent Origination. Excerpt from the Samyutta Nikaya, Connected Discourses. I have heard it thus. Once, the Buddha was residing in the city of Rajagaha, atop Vulture Peak Mountain within the bamboo grove of Kalanda. A Brahmin practitioner named Vasta came to where the Buddha was resting. After offering greetings to the Buddha in the customary respectful manner, he sat to one side. He then spoke to the Buddha, "Venerable Gautama, do all beings possess a self?" The Buddha remained silent and did not respond. Vasta asked again, "So, there is no self?" Once more the Buddha did not offer any response. Then Vasta thought to himself, "I have asked the ascetic Gautama several times about this matter, yet he remains silent and does not provide an answer." At that moment, Ananda, who was attending to the Buddha, heard this and spoke to the Buddha. "Venerable Sir, why did the Blessed One not respond to Vatsa's question? If the Blessed One does not answer, he will say, I asked the Tathagata, but the Tathagata did not know how to respond, and this will only make him more convinced of his erroneous views, will it not? The Buddha said to Ananda, previously he had raised the question, do all phenomena have a self? And isn't asking such a question a way to make him more assured in his erroneous views? Because there is no self, so if I were to answer his question, I would be contradicting the principle of the path. Why is that? Because there is no self in all phenomena, so what self is there for me to speak of to him? Doing so would only reinforce his confusion that has existed until now. Moreover, Ananda, if I say there is a self, I would fall into the concept of eternalism, and if I say there is no self, I would fall into the concept of annihilationism. When the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma, he avoids both these extremes and stays on the middle path. Because all phenomena are impermanent, they do not last, but there is a continuation, so they are not annihilated. Therefore, they do not last, yet they are not annihilated. It is simply because of a cause that this arises, because this arises, that arises, and because this does not arise, that does not arise. Therefore, due to ignorance conditions formations, activities born of will and the workings of karma, bodily actions, verbal actions, mental actions, due to formations arises consciousness, due to consciousness arises name and form, mental and physical phenomena. Due to name and form arises the 6 sense bases, including the 5 senses in the mind. Due to the 6 sense bases arises contact. Due to contact arises feeling. Due to feeling arises craving. Due to craving arises clinging. Due to clinging arises becoming. Due to becoming arises birth. Due to birth arise aging and death, along with sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. Thus, when the cause ceases, the effect ceases, meaning when ignorance ceases, formation cease. When formation cease, consciousness ceases. When consciousness ceases, name and form cease. When name and form cease, the 6 sense bases cease. When the 6 sense bases cease, contact ceases. When contact ceases, feeling ceases. When feeling ceases, craving ceases. When craving ceases, clinging ceases. When clinging ceases, becoming ceases. When becoming ceases, birth ceases. When birth ceases, aging and death cease, including sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair, and thus a great mass of suffering ceases. After the Buddha expounded these teachings, the monks who heard them joyfully accepted the teachings and together put them into practice. It's crucial to understand that each element here is both a cause and an effect, and also a condition, pratityasamutpada, or dependent origination. Hence, they are all relative, interdependent, and interconnected, with nothing being absolute or isolated. Therefore, Buddhism does not acknowledge a first cause. Dependent origination should be seen as a circle, not as a chain. Conclusion. What is commonly referred to as the soul, self, or ego is to denote an absolute, eternal entity within a person, an immutable essence behind the ever-changing phenomenal world. According to some religions, each person has such a separate soul created by God, and after death, this soul will live forever either in hell or in heaven. Its fate depends on the judgment of its creator. In other religions, this soul goes through many lives until it is completely purified and ultimately becomes one with God or Brahman, the universal soul or Atman, from which it originated. The soul or self in a person is the entity that thinks, feels, and receives reward or punishment for all its good and bad actions. Such a concept is known as the idea of self. Buddhism is unique in the history of human religion in that it denies the existence of a soul, self, or Atman. According to the teachings of the Buddha, the concept of the self is a delusion that does not exist in reality, giving rise to harmful thoughts of me and mine, selfish desires, attachment, hatred, malice, arrogance, pride, and other impurities and troubles. It is the source of all complications in life, ranging from personal disputes to wars between nations. In short, all the world's aberrations stem from this misconceived notion. There are two deeply ingrained notions in human psychology: self-preservation and self-perpetuation. For self-preservation, humans have created God to rely on, to protect themselves, to feel safe and secure, like a child depends on its parents. For self-perpetuation, the idea of an immortal soul or Atman was created, which would live forever. In ignorance, weakness, fear, and desire, people need these concepts for consolation. Thus, they cling to them fervently and deeply. The teaching of Buddhism does not support this ignorance, fear, and desire, but aims to enlighten by eliminating and eradicating them, striking at their root. According to Buddhism, our ideas about God and the soul are misguided and void, although these ideas have been strongly developed into theories, all of which are mere projections of the extremely subtle consciousness, wrapped in a complex philosophical and metaphysical discourse. These ideas have become so ingrained in human psychology, so familiar and close to them that they are not willing to hear or understand any doctrine that contradicts them. The Buddha was well aware of this. Indeed, he taught that his doctrine is against the current, going against the selfish desires of humans. For 4 weeks after his enlightenment, sitting under a tree, he reflected, "I have realized a profound truth, difficult to perceive, understand, visible only to the wise. Those dominated by passion and shrouded in ignorance cannot see this truth, for it goes against the current. It is sublime, deep, subtle, and hard to comprehend." Thinking thus, the Buddha hesitated for a moment, wondering if it would be futile to attempt to explain the truth he had realized to the world. He then compared the world to a lotus pond. In it, many lotuses are submerged under the water. Some are just emerging above the water, but there are also those flowers that have risen above the lake and are no longer in contact with the water. Similarly, in this world, human beings are at different levels of development. There are some who will understand the truth. Therefore, the Buddha decided to teach this truth. The doctrine of Anatta, or non-self, is a natural consequence, or inference from the analysis of the 5 aggregates, skandhas, and the teaching of dependent origination, paticca samuppada. What we call a soul or individual is made up of 5 aggregates, and when we analyze and examine them closely, there is nothing behind them that can be called I, Atman, self, or any other permanent entity. This is the method of analysis. We arrive at a similar result when examining the principle of dependent origination, the method of synthesis, and according to this principle, nothing in the world is absolute. All phenomena, dharmas, are limited, relative, and interdependent. This is the doctrine of relativity in Buddhism.